Douglas, thank you for joining us on Spectator TV.
Very good to be here live.
Good to see you. You write in your column this week about a remarkable incident when you think back in 2009, when a Dutch politician, who certainly wasn't as big then as he is now, was denied entry to the UK. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I remember the affair very well. Geert Wilders, who was then already a member of the parliament in the Netherlands, was meant to come to the UK, had been invited to give a speech at the House of Lords by a couple of peers, and he was turned away at the border. And this was quite an insult. I mean, I don't think that people quite realised at the time. The Dutch ambassador turned up at the airport, and it's a serious matter they regard as an insult. But he was turned away because the then Labour Home Secretary, Jackie Smith, had decided that he should not be allowed to enter the country because his views on Islam could be not conducive to the public good. And I said at the time, that's why I mentioned it in the piece, I said at the time to Jackie Smith and to the people who supported her move, what'll you do when Wilders is Prime Minister? Mm. Now, Wilders is not quite Prime Minister, but he won, overwhelmingly won the number of seats at the Dutch elections last November. He's putting together a government. The main centre-right party, the VVD, is going in with him. And I just think it throws up, as I say in my piece, a very interesting question, which is, in Britain, we have been very, very much misjudging what has been going on the continent for a long time now. And one of the oddities is that the people who present themselves as most Europhile are the ones who've actually ignored the developments the most.
And it's not just Wilders as well, you say in your piece. No. Can you give some other examples there? I think you mentioned, for example, the national conference which Daniel Kaczynski went to.
Yes, I was at a conference with Daniel Kaczynski in Rome in 2020. And there were representatives of all the main conservative governments across Europe. Viktor Orban was there, and Giorgia Meloni was one of the speakers. And Daniel Kaczynski, Matteo Salvini was meant to be there, then didn't actually turn up in the end, but he was a much more prominent figure at the time, having been interior minister in Italy. Daniel Kaczynski almost had the conservative whip withdrawn. Certainly people like Margaret Hodge of the Labour Party called for him to have the whip withdrawn. Members of his own party called for it. Because Daniel Kaczynski had appeared at a conference with these right-wingers from the continent. And I remember saying the same thing then. What's going to happen when Giorgia Meloni is Prime Minister? Well, we actually got the answer because 3 years after the conference, Giorgia Meloni is just around the corner from here on Downing Street, kissing Rishi Sunak, and both of them talking about how wonderful the relationship is between Italy and the UK. Again, you could see this coming. But on that occasion, it was even faster, because that was just 3 years between you're not allowed in a room with this woman to Prime Minister Meloni, how wonderful to see you. Again, it's a terrible misjudgment that's been going on in this country. The continent is turning right. And not in the way that the BBC, for instance, would like to portray it as, the right is marching, on the march. They always say the right is on the march. The left is never on the march, it seems. They just slope or something. But they want to run their, the right is on the march pieces. This isn't that. This isn't fascism or anything like that. But it is a definite move. When you get Meloni in Italy, of course, Central and Eastern European countries we know about. You have the AfD in Germany, which is a very, very complicated one, and is definitely a number of things. But you have Wilders in the Netherlands. You have the expectation that Marine Le Pen's party is going to come out on top at the European elections this weekend. And what is in the offing is a new group that Ursula von der Leyen may well have to work with or find a way to run with, which will be dominated by political parties that both centrist conservatives and the Labour Party in this country have demonized as being outrageous far-right parties, when in actual fact these parties have been reflecting the immigration concerns and the security concerns that are overwhelmingly shifting politics across the European continent.
I was going to ask you this. So do you think it's a misjudgment in terms of the politicians they were judging? So perhaps say Jackie Smith now or Margaret Hodge will say, well, even if they were going to become successful, the likes of Wilders and Maloney, they were beyond the pale then, therefore we should have treated them in this way. Do you think, and they would maybe argue now, oh, these politicians have detoxified and changed, take Le Pen and her party, for example. Do you think there's anything to that?
Well, there is always give and take. Le Pen has obviously detoxified her party very significantly, although, there's a sort of, around the margins still there can be a slightly vitiate smell. Wilders certainly has said things that no British politician would say. But, I was in Paris a couple of days ago and with French centrists and left-wing politicians, all of whom say things that no conservative in the UK would say. I mean, former Prime Minister Manuel Valls, who's a leftist, who I saw the other day, when he was Prime Minister, he said things that the right of the Tory party would balk at. Why? Because they've got a serious demographic and immigration and illegal immigration issue and a serious security concern. People don't realize that ahead of the Olympic Games in Paris,
of course, yeah.
the city is in very near lockdown in the centre. They just thwarted another plot to carry out a terrorist attack during it. Everybody is on the edge about it. That's why the situation in the country changed and politicians changed in response. I think it's very interesting that Britain is the outlier in this, mainly, of course, because of the ignominious behaviour of the Conservative Party for the last 14 years. They're almost certainly going to be booted out of power. But it means that Britain will be the only party, I think, in the West that will be electing a left-wing government. As I say, that's because of the idiocy of the Tories. But nevertheless, it's very interesting because everywhere else, people are actually in the political class reacting to the deep sociological changes and security changes that are going on in our societies. British politicians don't, in the main, have the guts to do that. But their continental contemporaries, they do.
And you're right, it's going to be a very interesting dynamic when we have a Labour government in power dealing with a Europe that they couldn't be more ideologically opposed to. I mean, how do you think they're going to handle that?
I think it's a great cosmic joke. It's another recommendation about the existence of the deity. I mean, they will have, I mean, again, it goes back to my Jackie Smith example. Who do you want to deal with? Who do you think is kosher, as it were? And the answer for a lot of them is sort of nobody. As I say in the piece, maybe if Donald Trump wins the election in November, it'll be rather funny seeing, presumably, Foreign Secretary David Lammy, who said so many unpleasant things about Trump in the past. It'll be rather interesting seeing David Lammy trying to deal with him. I don't think Trump will be very forgiving about it.
Yeah, I was going to say, what do you think Trump will make of that?
Trump remembers slights.
Yeah.
He remembers them very, very well and long. So it'll be interesting. As I say in the piece, maybe the Labour government will end up in the strange position of not wanting to speak to any foreigners. It would seem rather xenophobic to me, but it might be the situation they get themselves into.
After this weekend, we're obviously expecting big European election results. Do you think that's going to change Europe in a dramatic way, or do you think this is more just of an indication of where the continent is heading more generally?
It's an indication of where the continent is heading. I think that many of the countries I've been to recently in Europe, people regard the Euros as something like the equivalent of the American midterms. You know, it's quite an effective way to punish the people in power. And of course, turnout everywhere is, I mean, as we know in this country, when we were still voting in EU elections, turnout is woeful in most countries. But nevertheless, European Parliament has a lot of power and influence. If there is, for instance, a right-wing bloc that can make some kind of agreement on international protocols about migration and so on, and things could change. But I mean, I'm not optimistic about that simply because I've seen quite a lot of politicians who've wanted to do something about that come and go. And some of them, as I've said in the magazine before, some of them even get prosecuted for doing the right thing, like Matteo Salvini was in Italy, accused of kidnapping for stopping one of the illegal boats from landing. And the wonderful Inger Støjberg in Denmark, who had an ankle bracelet because of doing something completely reasonable in 2015 and trying to stop illegal migration to her country. So, you know, in Europe, quite often doing the right thing leads to bad ends for you, whereas doing the wrong thing, as so many of our politicians have, sees you glide off into a perfectly well remunerated retirement.
I was going to suggest maybe is this why the sort of populist right is doing so well now, is that they've had such sort of treatment from institutions within Europe. A lot have had brush with the criminal law, perhaps. Do you think that's why they're doing so well now, that people sort of look at that and say, you've been dealt with unfairly?
It's possible. I mean, Wilders has been repeatedly threatened with prosecution and prosecuted in the Netherlands for so-called hate speech. One of the cases against him related to a rally in a previous election in which he asked the crowd, do you want more Moroccan immigration or less? And they chanted less or fewer. I can't remember what exactly the word was in Dutch. But the point is that he was prosecuted over that. Well, but that's absurd, because that means that if you ask people if they want more Moroccans in their society or not, the only legal answer is yes, more, which is not sustainable either as a policy or as a political strategy.
And you mentioned, we in Britain seem to be the outlier here in Europe. At this time, it definitely seems because of the sort of the incompetence of the Conservatives. Yeah. But when the rest of Europe is sort of going this way, do you think at any point it could happen here as well? I mean, we've had Nigel Farage announce his candidacy this last week.
Well, I mean, it's rather hard for me to analyse that, because I've got what I would like to see happen and what may happen. I've always had the view that it's possible that in Britain, migration would only be sorted out by a left-wing government. I mean, it was a left-wing government that gave us the worst migration of recent times, but the Conservatives gave them a run for their money, gave the Blairs a run for the money. But in a way, because the right says it wants to do things and then is incompetent, then pays the political price for saying they want to do it and doesn't get it done. And so it's the worst of all worlds. Britain is an anomaly at the moment, because we have several different things that are cutting through at different angles through the political process. I would like to see a real response to what is going on. I don't think that the immigration levels that the Conservative Party has left us with are remotely sustainable. I don't want Britain to be bringing in 1 million people a year. I don't want to see the countryside even more bulldozed over and flattened out and rather ugly development sites put on. I'd quite like my country to remain recognisable. And I think that's a sentiment shared by a majority of the public, according to all polls. And yet, what I've just said is not something that the Conservative Party can say or do anything about, and it's not something the Labour Party can say or do anything about yet. We are an anomaly like that. Maybe Farage will blow it up. I mean, the Conservatives have blown themselves up. It'll be very hard to know what remains of them after the election. But it's a bizarre situation historically to end up in. The only country going to the left, and with real ignoramuses at the top. I can never get over the fact that David Lammy seems to believe that a man can grow a cervix if he takes the right medication.
And a man who was campaigning for us to rejoin the EU at one point. Now there's the irony there, isn't
yes, absolutely. I mean, the irony of a Labour government which is almost certainly going to try to drag us back into the common market or something, some kind of back door or side door. The irony of that party wanting to pull us back into a Europe which they don't like. As I say, it's like a divine joke.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Douglas.
Thank you.